Sarah Matthews adjusted her worn leather purse on her shoulder as she walked through the automatic doors of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The cool morning air gave way to the controlled climate inside the terminal, and she could feel the nervous energy that always came with flying. At 52, Sarah had only been on an airplane 3 times in her entire life, and each time felt like a small miracle. She wore her best dress, a navy blue one she had bought from a thrift store 5 years ago for her nephew's wedding. Her shoes were comfortable walking shoes, practical but polished. Sarah believed in looking her best, even when no one important was watching. Her grandmother had taught her that dignity was something you wore, not something others gave you. The reason for her trip filled her with both urgency and sadness. Her mother, Rosa Matthews, was lying in a hospital bed back in Mobile, Alabama. At 83, Rosa had suffered a stroke 3 days ago, and the doctors weren't sure how much time she had left. Sarah had worked as a housekeeper for the Pemberton family for only 3 months, but when she explained her situation, Mrs. Elizabeth Pemberton had not only given her time off but had also paid for her plane ticket. "Family comes first, Sarah," Mrs. Pemberton had said, pressing the airline confirmation into Sarah's hands. "Take as much time as you need." Sarah had been touched by the kindness. The Pemberton family lived in one of Chicago's most exclusive neighborhoods, in a mansion that seemed to have more rooms than some hotels. Mr. Richard Pemberton was some kind of businessman, though Sarah was never quite sure what kind of business he was in. He seemed to have a lot of meetings in his home office, and important-looking people visited regularly. As she made her way through the airport security line, Sarah thought about the past 3 months working for the Pembertons. It had been different from her other housekeeping jobs. The pay was significantly better, almost suspiciously so. She was paid in cash every week, which was unusual but not unheard of in her line of work. The house itself was beautiful but had an odd feeling to it, like there were secrets hidden in its perfectly decorated rooms. Mrs. Pemberton was kind but nervous, always checking over her shoulder when she spoke. Mr. Pemberton was polite but distant, and their teenage son Marcus barely acknowledged her existence. Sarah had learned over her 28 years of housekeeping to read families like books, and the Pemberton book had pages that seemed to be missing. After passing through security, Sarah found her gate and settled into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs to wait for her flight. She pulled out her phone to call the hospital for an update on her mother's condition. The news wasn't good. Rosa was stable but hadn't regained consciousness since the stroke. Sarah closed her eyes and said a small prayer, the same one she had been saying since she was 7 years old, and her father had taught it to her. She prayed for her mother's healing, for traveling mercies, and for strength to handle whatever lay ahead. As she sat waiting, Sarah's mind wandered to a memory from the previous week. She had been cleaning Mr. Pemberton's office when she had accidentally knocked over a stack of papers from his desk. As she bent to pick them up, she couldn't help but notice some of the documents. They had official-looking letterheads and words she didn't fully understand, but what caught her attention were the photographs attached to some of the papers. The photos showed what looked like a warehouse or large building, and there were people in them, but something about the images had made her uncomfortable. The people in the photos looked scared, and some appeared to be very young. Sarah had quickly gathered the papers and put them back where she found them, but the images had stayed with her. When Mr. Pemberton came home that evening, he had gone straight to his office. Sarah heard him making phone calls, his voice tense and urgent. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. He was worried about something. Sarah tried to push these thoughts from her mind. She had learned long ago that the best housekeepers saw everything and said nothing. It wasn't her job to understand her employer's business, just to keep their homes clean and their privacy respected. Her flight was called, and Sarah gathered her small carry-on bag. She had packed light, not knowing how long she would need to stay in Alabama. Inside her bag were a change of clothes, her mother's favorite cookies that she had baked the night before, and a small photo album filled with pictures of family. As she walked toward the gate, Sarah felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching her. She turned around but saw only the typical airport crowd, people rushing to their own destinations with their own stories and worries. She shook off the feeling and continued walking. The boarding process was routine. Sarah had an aisle seat toward the back of the plane, which suited her perfectly. She wasn't fond of looking out airplane windows, preferring to keep her feet mentally on the ground even when her body was thousands of feet in the air. As the plane filled with passengers, Sarah noticed a man in a dark suit who seemed to be paying attention to her. He was seated several rows ahead, but she caught him looking back in her direction multiple times. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away. Sarah told herself she was being paranoid, that the stress of her mother's condition was making her imagine things. The flight attendants went through their safety presentation, and Sarah half listened while thinking about what she would say to her mother when she reached the hospital. The doctors had said that coma patients could often hear what was happening around them, so Sarah had been planning conversations, stories to tell, and songs to sing that might help bring her mother back. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She quickly checked it, thinking it might be an update from the hospital. Instead, it was from a number she didn't recognize. "Sarah, this is FBI agent Jennifer Collins. Do not get on that plane. Your life may be in danger. Stay exactly where you are." Sarah stared at the message, reading it 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. FBI? Danger? This had to be some kind of mistake or perhaps a cruel joke. She looked around the plane, but everyone seemed normal, focused on their own pre-flight routines. Her phone buzzed again. "This is not a joke. The Pemberton family is under federal investigation. You may have information that could help us, and there are people who don't want you to testify. Please trust me and get off the plane now." Sarah's heart began to race. The plane was moving faster now, approaching the runway. The flight attendants had taken their seats, and the pilot was making his final announcements. Sarah raised her hand to try to get a flight attendant's attention, but they were all strapped in for takeoff. The man in the dark suit was looking at her again, and this time he wasn't looking away. His expression was cold, calculating. Sarah noticed that his hands were in his jacket, and she had a terrible feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. Sarah stood up from her seat, ignoring the surprised looks from other passengers. "Excuse me," she called out loudly. "I need to get off this plane. There's been an emergency." The plane was still moving, but it hadn't reached takeoff speed yet. A flight attendant unstrapped herself and approached Sarah. "Ma'am, we're preparing for takeoff. You'll need to take your seat immediately." "Please," Sarah said, her voice urgent but trying to remain calm. "I've just received word that my mother has taken a turn for the worse. I need to get off this plane right now." It wasn't entirely untrue. Sarah's mother was in critical condition, and Sarah's life might indeed be in danger if the text messages were real. The flight attendant looked uncertain, glancing toward the cockpit. The man in the dark suit was now standing up as well, moving toward the back of the plane where Sarah was seated. His movement was deliberate, predatory. Sarah's instincts, honed by years of reading people and situations, told her that this man meant her harm. "Sir, please return to your seat," the flight attendant called to the man, but he ignored her, continuing his approach toward Sarah. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She pushed past the flight attendant and ran toward the front of the plane, calling out, "Help! That man is following me! I need to get off this plane right now!" The commotion she created was exactly what she needed. Other passengers began to turn and look, some standing up to see what was happening. The man in the dark suit stopped his approach, realizing that he now had dozens of witnesses watching his every move. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to return to the gate due to a passenger emergency. Please remain in your seats." As the plane turned around and headed back to the terminal, Sarah kept her eyes on the man in the dark suit. He had returned to his seat but was now speaking quietly into his phone, his eyes never leaving her. When the plane reached the gate, Sarah was the first passenger off. As she walked up the jetway, her phone buzzed again. Agent Collins here. Well done. There are officers waiting for you in the terminal. Look for the woman in the red jacket near the information desk. Sarah's legs felt shaky as she entered the terminal. Everything she thought she knew about her life had just changed in the span of 20 minutes. She was no longer just a housekeeper worried about her sick mother. She was apparently a witness in a federal investigation, and people wanted her dead. As she approached the information desk, she saw a woman in a red jacket who looked official and alert. The woman spotted Sarah and approached her quickly. Sarah Matthews? I'm Agent Collins. Thank you for trusting my message. We need to get you somewhere safe immediately. Before Sarah could ask any questions, Agent Collins was guiding her through the terminal. As they walked quickly past shops and restaurants, Sarah looked over her shoulder and saw the man from the plane had gotten off as well. He was following them, trying to stay hidden in the crowd but maintaining visual contact. He's behind us, Sarah whispered to Agent Collins. I know, the agent replied calmly. That's exactly what we want. We've been trying to identify him for weeks. By following you, he's just given us the evidence we need. As they reached a security checkpoint that Sarah hadn't seen before, Agent Collins showed her badge to the guards. They were immediately waved through into a restricted area of the airport. Agent Collins, Sarah said as they walked through a corridor marked Airport Personnel Only. What is this about? What does this have to do with the family I work for? Agent Collins stopped walking and turned to face Sarah. Sarah, how much do you know about Richard Pemberton's business? I know he has meetings at the house, and important people visit him. He seems to have a lot of money. But I never paid much attention. I just cleaned the house. What you've been cleaning, Agent Collins said carefully, is the headquarters of one of the largest human trafficking operations in the Midwest. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Human trafficking. Those photos she had seen in Mr. Pemberton's office suddenly made horrible sense. The scared faces, the young people, the warehouse-like building. Oh my God! Sarah whispered. Those pictures I saw. You saw pictures? When? Sarah told Agent Collins about the papers she had accidentally knocked over, describing the photos and documents she had briefly seen. As she talked, the agent's expression became more intense. Sarah, those documents you saw are the missing piece of our investigation. We've been building a case against the Pembertons for 8 months, but we haven't been able to get access to their home base of operations. You might be the only person who can help us identify the location where these crimes are taking place. They had reached a small office area where several other agents were waiting. Sarah recognized the setup from crime shows on television, but being in the middle of it felt surreal and frightening. What about my mother? Sarah asked. I need to get to Alabama. She's dying. Agent Collins looked sympathetic but serious. Sarah, I understand how important your mother is to you. But right now, you're the most important witness we have in a case that could save dozens of lives. The Pembertons have been trafficking young women and children for years. If we don't stop them now, with your help, many more people will suffer. Sarah sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was hearing. She had always prided herself on being observant and intuitive about people, but she had completely missed the fact that she was working in a house where such terrible crimes were being planned. How did you know I was in danger? She asked. We've been monitoring the Pemberton family's communications. When they learned that you were traveling today, they became concerned that you might have seen or heard something that could be used against them. They arranged for someone to follow you and ensure that you never reached your destination. The reality of how close she had come to being hurt, or worse, began to sink in. Sarah thought about the man on the plane, how he had been moving toward her with such determination. If she hadn't received Agent Collins's warning, if she hadn't trusted her instincts, she might not be sitting here right now. What happens next? Sarah asked. Agent Collins leaned forward. We need your help to identify the location in those photographs. We also need you to help us understand the layout of the Pemberton house and the patterns of the people who visit. But most importantly, we need you to be willing to testify about what you've seen. Sarah thought about her mother lying in a hospital bed 300 miles away. She thought about the scared faces in those photographs. She thought about the young people who might be suffering right now while she sat in this safe office. "If I help you," she said quietly, "what guarantee do I have that I'll be safe? That my family will be safe? That's why we're here," Agent Collins said. "We're going to provide you with protection. Full protection. And Sarah, there's something else you should know." Agent Collins opened a folder and pulled out a photograph. It was an older picture, and Sarah recognized herself in it immediately. She was much younger, maybe 25, and she was standing outside a courthouse. 27 years ago, you testified in a case against a man named Marcus Thompson. Do you remember?" Sarah's blood went cold. Marcus Thompson. She hadn't heard that name in decades, but she would never forget it. Thompson had been her employer's brother-in-law, and she had witnessed him assaulting a young woman. Sarah had been the only witness willing to testify against him, despite threats and pressure to keep quiet. "How do you know about that?" "Because Marcus Thompson is Richard Pemberton's business partner. And Sarah, we think your hiring wasn't a coincidence. We think they've been planning this for a very long time." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in Sarah's mind. The overly generous pay, the cash payments, the nervous behavior of Mrs. Pemberton. They had hired her specifically because of her past testimony against Thompson. They had been planning to use her testimony as leverage, or perhaps they had been planning to silence her permanently. "They hired me to get revenge," Sarah said, the realization making her feel sick. "We believe so. But Sarah, by hiring you, they made a mistake. You've seen things that can help us shut down their operation and save lives. You have the power to stop them." Sarah looked around the room at the agents waiting for her decision. She thought about her mother, who had raised her to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. She thought about her father, who had taught her that sometimes ordinary people had to do extraordinary things. "What do I need to do?" she asked. Agent Collins smiled for the first time since they had met. "First, we're going to make sure you're safe. Then, we're going to plan how to gather the evidence we need. And Sarah, we're going to make sure you get to see your mother. I promise." As the agents began to explain their plan, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had spent her entire life cleaning up other people's messes, keeping their secrets, and staying invisible. For the first time, her presence, her observations, and her willingness to speak the truth were going to matter in a way that could change lives. She didn't know it yet, but her decision in that airport office would set in motion a series of events that would require the protection of 14 specially trained police dogs and would ultimately bring down one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the region. But first, she had to survive the next 24 hours. The safe house was nothing like what Sarah had expected. Located in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 30 miles outside Chicago, it looked like any other middle-class family home. White siding, a small front yard with well-maintained grass, and a blue Honda Accord in the driveway that Agent Collins explained belonged to the cover identity they would be using. "The key to staying safe," Agent Collins explained as they entered through the garage, "is looking ordinary. The Pemberton organization has connections throughout the city, but they're not expecting us to hide you in plain sight." Inside, the house was comfortable but clearly temporary. Generic furniture, no personal photographs, and a kitchen stocked with basic necessities. 2 other agents were waiting for them: Agent Marcus Rivera, a tall Hispanic man in his 40s who specialized in organized crime, and Agent Sarah Kim, a younger Asian woman who was an expert in digital forensics. "Sarah," Agent Collins said, "these agents will be working with us on your case. Agent Rivera has been investigating human trafficking networks for 15 years, and Agent Kim will be helping us analyze any digital evidence we can gather." Sarah shook hands with both agents, still feeling like she was living in someone else's life. 12 hours ago, her biggest worry had been catching her flight to Alabama. Now she was in federal protection, helping to investigate crimes she could barely comprehend. "Before we begin," Agent Rivera said gently, We need to address your mother's situation. Agent Kim has been in contact with the hospital in Mobile. Sarah's heart jumped. Is she okay? Has there been any change? Agent Kim pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a video call screen. The hospital has been very cooperative. They understand the situation, and they've arranged for you to have regular video calls with your mother's medical team. They've also set up a camera in her room so you can see her whenever you want. The screen showed Sarah's mother lying in the hospital bed, connected to various machines but looking peaceful. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she saw her mother's face. Can she hear me if I talk to her through this? Yes, Agent Kim said. The doctors say that coma patients often respond to familiar voices. We've arranged for you to have scheduled calls throughout the day, and the nursing staff will hold the tablet so your mother can hear you clearly. Sarah reached out to touch the screen, wishing she could hold her mother's hand. Mama, it's me. It's Sarah. I'm here, and I'm going to be okay. You focus on getting better, you hear me? For the next few minutes, Sarah talked to her mother through the screen, telling her about the plane ride and promising that she would see her soon. The agents respectfully stepped away to give her privacy, and Sarah felt a small measure of peace knowing she could still be connected to her mother even while in protection. When the call ended, Agent Collins sat down across from Sarah at the kitchen table. Now, we need to talk about what you saw in the Pemberton house. I know this is difficult, but every detail could be important. Sarah took a deep breath and began to describe everything she could remember from her 3 months working for the family. She talked about the layout of the house, the schedule of visitors, and the unusual security measures she had noticed. There were cameras everywhere, she said. Not just at the entrances, but inside the house too. And Mr. Pemberton's office was always locked when he wasn't there. I was only allowed to clean it when he was present. Agent Rivera took notes as Sarah spoke. What about the visitors? Can you describe any of them? Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember faces. There was a woman who came by regularly, maybe twice a week. She was well-dressed, probably in her 50s, and she always carried a briefcase. Mr. Pemberton would meet with her in his office for hours. Can you describe her more specifically? She had blonde hair, always styled perfectly. Expensive clothes, nice jewelry. She drove a black Mercedes. And she was always nervous, checking her phone constantly. Agent Kim looked up from her laptop. That could be Caroline Hendricks. She's a lawyer who we suspect has been facilitating the legal aspects of the trafficking operation. Sarah continued describing other visitors, the strange packages that were sometimes delivered, and the times when Mr. Pemberton seemed particularly stressed or angry. As she talked, the agents exchanged meaningful looks, and Sarah realized that her observations were providing them with information they hadn't had before. Sarah, Agent Collins said, you mentioned seeing photographs in Mr. Pemberton's office. Do you think you could identify the location if you saw it again? Maybe. The building in the photos looked like a warehouse or factory. It had a distinctive shape, kind of like an L, and there were loading docks on one side. Agent Rivera pulled out a map of the Chicago area and spread it on the table. We've identified several properties that the Pemberton organization owns or rents. Can you look at these addresses and see if any of them seem familiar? Sarah studied the map, trying to remember any conversations she might have overheard. There was one time when Mr. Pemberton was on the phone, and he mentioned something about Riverside. He said they needed to move the operation because of increased police patrols in the area. Agent Kim immediately began typing on her laptop. Riverside Industrial District. That's about 20 miles south of the city. There are dozens of warehouses and manufacturing facilities in that area. Can you show me satellite images of the warehouses in Riverside? Sarah asked. For the next hour, they went through satellite photographs of industrial buildings in the Riverside area. Sarah studied each image carefully, trying to match them with what she remembered from the photographs in Mr. Pemberton's office. This one, she said suddenly, pointing to an image on the screen. This L-shaped building with the loading docks. The fence around it looks the same, and there's a smaller building next to it that was in the background of one of the photos. Agent Rivera leaned in to look at the image. That's 1247 Industrial Boulevard. It's listed as a textile warehouse, but the company that supposedly rents it doesn't exist. We've been suspicious of this location for months. What happens now? Sarah asked. Agent Collins looked at her teammates before answering. Now we need to gather enough evidence to get a search warrant for that location. But Sarah, we also need to talk about your safety. The Pemberton organization knows you didn't get on that plane, and they're going to be looking for you. As if on cue, Agent Kim's laptop chimed with an alert. She looked at the screen and frowned. We've got a problem. The Pemberton house is showing a lot of activity. Multiple vehicles have arrived, and our surveillance team reports that several men with criminal backgrounds have been seen entering the property. They're planning something, Agent Rivera said grimly. Agent Collins turned to Sarah. We need to move you to a more secure location. This safe house was always meant to be temporary. Sarah felt a chill of fear. Where will you take me? There's a federal facility about 50 miles from here. It's designed specifically for witness protection, and it has much better security. Before Sarah could respond, all three agents' phones started buzzing simultaneously. Agent Collins answered hers first. What? When? Are you sure? Her expression grew increasingly serious as she listened. Okay, we're moving now. ETA 15 minutes. She hung up and looked at her colleagues. The Pemberton house just exploded. Sarah gasped. What do you mean exploded? Agent Rivera was already moving, gathering files and equipment. It means they're destroying evidence. And it means they know we're closing in. Agent Kim packed up her laptop. The good news is that our surveillance team confirms the explosion was controlled. It was meant to destroy documents and computers, not to hurt anyone. The bad news is that this level of evidence destruction suggests they're preparing to shut down their entire operation. Which means, Agent Collins added, looking directly at Sarah, they're going to be even more desperate to silence anyone who can testify against them. As the agents prepared to leave the safe house, Sarah's mind raced with questions and fears. She thought about Mrs. Pemberton, who had been kind to her. Was she safe? Had she known about her husband's criminal activities? Agent Collins, Sarah said, what about Mrs. Pemberton and their son? Were they in the house when it exploded? Agent Collins paused in her packing. Our surveillance team saw them leave the house about an hour before the explosion. They're safe, but we don't know if they were willing participants in the criminal activities or innocent victims. As they prepared to leave through the garage, Agent Rivera's radio crackled with an urgent message. All units be advised. Multiple vehicles matching descriptions of Pemberton organization associates have been spotted in the area of the safe house. Possible compromise of location. Agent Collins immediately drew her weapon and motioned for Sarah to get down. They found us. Through the garage window, Sarah could see two black SUVs slowly driving down the street. The vehicles were moving too slowly to be normal traffic, and the tinted windows made it impossible to see who was inside. How did they find us so quickly? Agent Kim whispered. Agent Rivera was speaking quietly into his radio, calling for backup. Unknown. Could be inside information, could be tracking technology we missed. The SUVs stopped in front of the safe house. Sarah watched in terror as men in dark clothing got out of the vehicles. They weren't trying to hide their presence. They walked boldly toward the house, clearly confident in their mission. Agent Collins made a quick decision. We're going out the back. Kim, call for helicopter extraction. Rivera, take point. Sarah, stay between us and do exactly what we tell you. They moved quickly through the house toward the back door. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. As they reached the kitchen, the sound of the front door being kicked in echoed through the house. Federal agents! Search every room! Agent Collins called out loudly, hoping to fool the intruders into thinking there were more law enforcement officers in the house than just the three of them. They slipped out the back door into a small backyard. Beyond the yard was a wooded area that could provide cover if they could reach it. Agent Rivera led the way, moving carefully but quickly across the open space. Sarah had never been in a situation like this. Every instinct told her to run as fast as she could, but Agent Collins kept a steady hand on her shoulder, helping her move quietly and carefully. They reached the tree line just as Sarah heard shouts from inside the house. The men had discovered that the house was empty, and they would soon be searching the yard. "Helicopter is 5 minutes out," Agent Kim whispered. "There's a clearing about a quarter-mile through these woods where they can land." As they moved through the trees, Sarah could hear the men behind them spreading out to search the area. Some of them had flashlights, and the beams of light swept through the woods, coming dangerously close to their hiding spots. Agent Rivera found a deer path that allowed them to move more quickly through the dense undergrowth. Sarah tried to step carefully, but every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot in the quiet forest. They had been moving for about 10 minutes when Agent Collins's radio crackled softly. "Agent Collins, this is Helicopter Unit. We're approaching your location, but we have a problem. There are vehicles blocking all the access roads to the clearing. Recommend alternate extraction point." Agent Collins studied a map on her phone. "There's a school about half a mile east of here. Large parking lot, should be empty this time of night." As they changed direction, Sarah heard the sound of dogs barking in the distance. "Are those police dogs?" she asked hopefully. Agent Rivera shook his head grimly. "Those are tracking dogs. The Pemberton people brought them to hunt us down." The sound of barking was getting closer, and Sarah realized that running through the woods was no longer going to be enough to keep them safe. The dogs would be able to follow their scent much faster than they could travel on foot. "We need to get to water," Agent Kim said. "There's a stream that runs parallel to this path. If we can get into the water, it might throw off the dogs." They found the stream about 2 minutes later. It was shallow but running quickly, and the water was shockingly cold. Sarah gasped as they stepped into it, but she didn't complain. She understood that this might be their only chance to escape. They waited downstream for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. Sarah's feet were numb with cold, and her dress was soaked, but she kept moving. Behind them, the sound of barking continued, but it seemed to be getting more distant. Finally, they reached a point where the stream passed under a road. Agent Collins checked her phone for their location. "The school is just about 2 blocks from here. The helicopter should be waiting." They climbed out of the stream and onto the road. Sarah's legs were shaking from cold and exhaustion, but she forced herself to keep walking. Agent Rivera scouted ahead while Agent Kim stayed close to Sarah, constantly checking their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. When they reached the school, Sarah could see the helicopter waiting in the parking lot, its rotors turning slowly. It was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. As they approached the aircraft, Agent Collins turned to Sarah. "The next phase is going to be even more challenging. We're taking you to a federal facility where you'll be completely safe, but you'll also be completely isolated until we can bring this case to trial." Sarah looked back in the direction they had come from, thinking about how much her life had changed in just one day. This morning she had been a housekeeper planning to visit her sick mother. Now she was being evacuated by helicopter because dangerous criminals wanted her dead. "How long will I have to stay hidden?" she asked. Agent Collins helped her into the helicopter. "As long as it takes to bring down the entire organization. Sarah, what you've helped us learn today could save dozens of lives. The location you identified, the people you described, the patterns you observed, all of that is going to help us shut down a network that has been hurting people for years." As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked down at the school, the woods where they had been hunted, and the suburban neighborhood where the safe house had been compromised. Somewhere in those shadows, dangerous people were still searching for her, still determined to prevent her from telling the truth about what she had seen. But Sarah felt a determination growing inside her that was stronger than her fear. She thought about her mother, lying in that hospital bed, and the values that had been instilled in her from childhood. She thought about the scared faces in those photographs, young people who needed someone to speak up for them. Agent Collins handed her a headset so they could communicate over the noise of the helicopter. Sarah, I want you to know that what you're doing is incredibly brave. Most people in your situation would be too frightened to help. Sarah looked out the window at the lights of Chicago passing below them. Agent Collins, I've been cleaning up other people's messes my whole life. But this is the first time I've had a chance to clean up a mess that really matters. As they flew through the night toward the federal facility, Sarah didn't know that her ordeal was just beginning. She didn't know that the Pemberton organization was much larger and more dangerous than anyone had realized. And she didn't know that in just a few days she would find herself standing in an airport terminal, surrounded by 14 police dogs, as the final confrontation of this case played out in the most dramatic way possible. But she did know one thing: she was going to see this through to the end, no matter what it cost her. Because sometimes, ordinary people have to do extraordinary things. And Sarah Matthews was about to discover just how extraordinary an ordinary person could be. Picture this: you're walking through the busy halls of Chicago's O'Hare Airport, rushing to catch your flight like thousands of other travelers. Suddenly you hear barking. Not just one dog, but many. You turn around and see something that makes you stop in your tracks. A middle-aged black woman in a simple uniform stands completely still in the center of the terminal, surrounded by 14 police dogs in a perfect circle. The dogs are not attacking. They're not even growling. They're sitting calmly, as if protecting her from something invisible to everyone else. The woman's name is Sarah Matthews, a 52-year-old housekeeper who had just finished cleaning the home of one of Chicago's most powerful families. She was supposed to be on a simple flight back to her hometown in Alabama to visit her sick mother. Instead, she found herself at the center of a mystery that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed what happened next. What you're about to read is not fiction. This is the true story of how one ordinary woman's extraordinary past collided with her present in the most unexpected way possible. It's a story about secrets that refuse to stay buried, about justice that arrives when you least expect it, and about how sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most ordinary places. Sarah had no idea that the simple cleaning job she had taken 3 months earlier would lead to this moment. She had no idea that the family she worked for had been hiding something so dangerous that it would eventually require the protection of 14 specially trained police dogs. And she definitely had no idea that her own forgotten past would be the key to solving one of the FBI's most challenging cases. This is her story. This is the story of how a housekeeper became the most important witness in a case that shook the foundations of power in America.